I wish you could take me away. I wish you could take me away, but nothing would happen today. Baby, I just want you to stay.
Hello, there we go. All right. Hey, everybody, welcome. Want to welcome everybody to the Community Clubhouse. Thank you guys for coming over here on a soggy day. Hope you didn't get too wet on the way over. So we have some amazing panelists lined up for you today. You guys can't hear? I'm a little too low. There we go. There we go. All right, I'll start over then. So welcome everybody to the Community Clubhouse. Hopefully you guys didn't get too wet. That's what I was saying. So my name is Ben Williams, head of business development for Two Hat at Xbox. We wanted to put this together because community is something that needs to be brought to the forefront. And so we're happy that everybody's here today to learn what we've got in these amazing panels coming up. But first, we're going to start off with a fireside chat with Oscar Clark and Kristen Cox from Xbox. Oscar's actually going to be our host for the day. So I'll bring them up now. I'll let them do their introducing. But thank you guys again for joining us. Oscar, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Brent, thanks. And like I say, you guys have already leveled up. Sorry, we brought it from England. Actually. Again, hopefully it's going to be an amazing day. Today we're going to be talking about community and the experience. Oh, actually, hope if I put the mic on. How about that? Da, da, da! We got a mic on. Yes. So now you can hear me. So yeah, we got an amazing array of people who are going to talk about community and experiences and toxicity and all the positivity that we can get out of creating these amazing gaming experiences that I think has profound effects on how we interact online in general. And I think the stuff that we've been doing in games for the last, well, for me, 26 years, in terms of understanding how people interact and share experiences online is so profoundly relevant, particularly post-pandemic, when we've seen a complete transition of how people have accepted the role of connectivity. So enough of me talking. I'm delighted to have my very nice friend here, Kristen. Do you want to explain who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Kristen Cox. I'm the director of business strategy for Xbox Game Studios Publishing, which is a little bit of word salad. But essentially what we do is we publish games for Xbox working with independent developers. So the rest of studios are sort of wholly owned studios that completely owned by Xbox. We actually work with independent developers to fully publish their titles. So some things that have come out of our studio have been like the Ori series, like Ori and the Blind Forest and Will of the Wisp, Microsoft Flight Simulator, Tell Me Why that we did with Dontnod. So there are some of the more recent ones that we've done.
So basically saying you've done some pretty awesome stuff.
I think we've done some pretty good stuff, yeah, over the years.
But I mean, but the thing is, you know, when people hear the kind of business strategy thing, that kind of hides the fact that you've been there at the pivotal kind of like cave, you know, tapping away at the coal face, trying to deal with all of the fun and gubbins before we had all this lovely tech that would making things easy.
Yes,
I have
not always been a business person. In fact, before I arrived at Xbox, I spent 16 years as a game developer, mostly as a designer and a game director, working almost exclusively on MMOs and large scale MMOs, starting back in the day when we actually mostly called them virtual worlds, back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then we stopped doing that and started calling them MMOs. And now everybody wants to call it a metaverse. So it just keeps changing. But
insert phrase here for
yeah, exactly. Yeah, in
connecting.
the future, someone will re-listen to this and be like, "Oh, you mean some other thing." But essentially making connected online experiences where people were coming together, and one of the primary motivators was for them to have some kind of social or community experience. So I worked with the team that made Toontown Online, and we made another MMO that no one remembers, which is Pirates of the Caribbean Online, RIP. But and then I worked on Nexon, running the global version of MapleStory, and then came over and worked on Guild Wars 2.
And if anyone doesn't know MapleStory, it's well worth checking out what the history of MapleStory. I am a massive fan of it because a lot of the things that we learn. I should explain who I am as well. I probably.
Yeah, who are you?
Yeah, who am I? Who is this strange guy in a hat? You previously seen on various other conferences doing hosting. So I've been around since 1998. In fact, actually, if I want to be really old, I did my first game pitch in 1987. I was told, "Great idea, come back when you've made it." Took me 10 years. But anyway, I used to run a thing called Wireplay, which is an online dial-up game service. Yes, dial-up. You may not have heard of this thing. You used to plug your phone into your computer. I know it's hard to imagine, but we used to play games like that. But my favorite story about Wireplay is that we saved Counter-Strike. You're welcome. They ran out of money. I bought them some new computers. They got bought by Valve, so therefore it's all me. Okay, maybe not, but anyway, this is the history. I've also done mobile phones. So back in like 2002, 3 to 6, I was running 3's mobile game platform. In the Java era, we made more money per user than any other operator in the world at the time. Of course, there was no money in Java at the time, but we still made more money than anyone else. And then
number one, and that's what matters.
Yes, I was number one. Number one. Yeah. And then on top of that, I was home architect on PlayStation Home, and some of you may have seen the hat for several years because I was the original evangelist for Unity ads back in the day. So I have been there, done that. I'm now a publisher of living games. So enough about me. Let's go back to MapleStory. Why do people remember people like me who are aficionados of making communities and games work well? Why would you say MapleStory was so profound?
So this great story, like when I was working on MapleStory, it had already been up and running for a little while, and we were bringing it out to the rest of the world, right? It had been up and running in Korea, and they had also made a launch in China, which is great. And so we were up and running for a while, and I went to Seoul, and I got to meet with some of the original creators of MapleStory, which was a couple of young guys who were like in a college dorm room. But we were having dinner, and somebody asked them, "What's MapleStory about? What is MapleStory?" And they said the most amazing thing. Like, it's maybe my favorite description of a video game ever. They said it's about sitting in town and looking cool.
Take my money now.
Yeah, I was like, wow, that's amazing, because we were running the game and we're dealing with localization, and the way that Nexon did it was we were a completely branched different version of the game. We had our own development pipeline, our own roadmap and everything, but we're like, wow, there's all this stuff in there. There's this RPG, there's tons of content, there's all this art, and he just boiled it right down. It's about sitting in town and looking cool. And to me, that's the heart of MapleStory, and it's the heart of a lot of live games.
But it also innovated because it was one of the first places where we started seeing revenue based on looking cool.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. There were most of our revenue came from cosmetics at the time, which was very different. Now it's sort of a very well understood sort of monetization strategy, but at the time was a little different, and we definitely grappled bringing it over to the West, because I think at the time in the original markets, it was like time that you would buy a hat for a week. And then at the end of the week, you had to give the hat back. And like Western audiences were not as excited about that.
Think about this, rental in your game.
Rentals,
yes. Consider rental.
Cosmetic rentals. Have you thought about it? Maybe don't. Yeah. No, there are ways it could work.
Hey, look, you say that, but we actually had rent in mobile games.
Yes.
We actually launched with rental as our primary model at 3,
Mhm.
and it was a complete disaster. We had to bring in buy games, but what we found afterwards, when we had games that had both rent and buy, we had like 9 times the revenue for the games that had rent as well. They didn't do the rent, but the fact of the rent meant
Yeah.
that they spent more money. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a great sort of about like price anchoring and stuff, but yeah, I mean it was a real lesson like to think about like what are people doing here? Like why are people coming back to MapleStory? I love MapleStory. I have a real place in my heart forever for MapleStory. But as an RPG, it's not like the most exciting and innovative RPG you can imagine. It's pretty basic stats, pretty basic combat. The people were coming back because there was a community there. And they were able to build a community there using techniques. Now, I think we'd be a little bit more sophisticated, but at the time they really hit on something, which was, there were these spaces, these town spaces where you could come and be safe and just socialize and just show off all of the amazing things that you've done. Brought a lot of that thinking in when I worked on Guild Wars 2. We spent a lot of time thinking about what's the downtime. Yeah, you're out there achieving, you're out there like, leveling up or getting the gear that you want to get. And then what? Because that part is really important too.
It's that TikTok kind of intensity relief, which as designers we think about in the game experience as well, but thinking about it as a community layer. Again, I think at the time Europe we had Habbo Hotel, I think was one of the other kind of experiences that had that kind of feel. Didn't have the same inherent reasons to be there, but it still had all those. And one of the things that I think, well, I never had any awareness. I mean, I'm sure there were, but I didn't have the same awareness of the toxicity that happened occasionally in Habbo, although they did lots of work to try and mitigate that. I didn't notice that as much in MapleStory.
Well, I think we had a wonderful community for sure, but also teenagers do tend to be pretty extreme.
Yes.
So we were grappling with that quite a bit and trying to figure out in that time, like how to approach that. Like, do you put a lot of really strong sort of parental style controls on this and, bring community managers in as sort of like authorities that sort of tell you to stop? Do you try to sort of guide the community to self-police in a way, or like to self-regulate the kind of behaviors that they are going to accept? And I think at the time, we were really just trying it out. Like we were really just trying things and seeing what worked. And a lot of what worked was being really honest and transparent and personable. We really tried to make sure that when you interacted with somebody at Nexon, they were a person, and they would listen to you, and you would be surprised at how reasonable, maybe I shouldn't use that word totally, but like that you could have a conversation with someone. And yes, we had to ban a lot of people that, at the time there's less sophisticated tools to deal with things like that.
Yep.
But there was a dialogue that existed with our community.
You're reminding me of my Wireplay days, particularly because at Wireplay we were part of British Telecom, which meant we actually had our own branch of the police force. I'm not kidding. We actually could send. We had one particular incident where a kid, 14-year-old kid, hacked our email server. I had 2 cops knock on his door. His parents were terrified. He was absolutely completely not back. Obviously, we didn't pursue it. It was all back there. But the interesting thing is, he became the best community manager I've ever worked with. And the fact was that these kids that were being kind of naughty were really just pushing boundaries.
Yeah.
Not always, but some weren't great. But a lot of them were really just pushing boundaries. And once you were transparent, once you were obvious, and when you showed you were not going to be playing games, well, you will be playing games, otherwise what we're doing, but you're not going to be playing games with them personally.
Right.
That when you say you're not going to put up with something and you don't, it's amazing how that improves the whole. I mean, I've got so many stories around that area, but I won't go.
And I mean, it's not that simple, as many people in this room know, but I am often surprised when I work with developers now. I work now with a lot of developers who come from a traditional console AAA background, who are for the first time making live games or live ops games or games with some kind of social or community component. I'm often surprised how much they don't necessarily believe you can have a lot of control over what kind of behavior is accepted in your community by being upfront about what you're going to accept and like having a point of view and having an opinion. What kind of community do you want? What kind of behaviors do you want to see out of your community? What are you not going to tolerate? There can be, I think, unfortunately, a sort of first approach to say, ooh, I don't want to be the one that decides. Like, we don't want to be the ones that have to decide that. Like, oh, how can I not be the one that makes that decision? But for developers, platform holders, people who are have some kind of hosting like capability for communities, that is your decision, and it really has to be. And I really do believe you'll have a lot more success with your community, meaning your community will be happier, your community will be healthier, you'll be proud of your community when you are really intentional.
It sounds almost like parental. We've got to have boundaries. Let's have boundaries.
Yeah, but I mean, boundaries are important, but also I think encouraging the things that you want to see. Another thing that I think comes up quite a lot that can maybe be a little bit difficult sometimes for developers to accept is that, in my experience, the kind of activities or actions that take place in a game have a pretty profound effect on the community. You can't really separate them completely.
Yeah, so we were running Quake, Counter-Strike, Unreal, and all sorts of other things. Bridge, would you believe? We actually had a Bridge service back in the Wireplay days. And we're talking about ancient history here.
Bridge?
Yeah. Oh, they're terrible. It was great, actually. I had my team have Bridge lessons just off the back of it. Fascinating. But I mean, the Quake community, particularly the QuakeNet of the era, was notorious for having a certain, should we say, misogynistic kind of mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a difficult thing to deal with, because when you're running an online gaming service where you're not actually controlling the communication channels,
right,
you have very little chance of banning somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to find other ways of handling it. I mean, we had our own internal ones, but people were also using those tools.
Right.
Obviously nowadays we've got different tools. We've got Discord, we've got other kind of platforms and stuff like that. How do you feel that this has changed in terms of like, is things easier now, or is the fact that there's so many more options for people that make it harder?
I mean, in some ways there are more tools, and you should take advantage of that, and that's great. And I think there's some sponsors for this event that are making some pretty great tools that are super helpful. Yeah. But it's also bigger. And the reach is bigger. There was a time earlier in the life cycle of sort of the World Wide Web and sort of past the Web 1.0 stage, where communities were more isolated. And there you could sort of really wrap your whole arms around a community and really understand everything that was happening. I think that's less true now, but I also think there has to be some acceptance of that, right? We have a world now where some of your community engagement is going to happen on owned channels, and some of it's not going to happen on owned channels. And there can be benefits to that as well, but you do just need to be aware of it. And I do think it's slightly more complex.
Just for some reason, that takes me to a game called Tribal Wars, where we were using Line because the in-game channel could be hacked. So we would, and this is a ridiculous, idiotic game. Don't ever play. It was lovely, but it was ridiculous how obsessive we got trying to make sure we got woken up at 4 a.m. just to make sure we could do a raid. Just why? But the reason I mention it is because it just shows you the profound, passionate level players get to,
yes,
and how this is not just a game to them. This is their hobby. This is their sense of identity.
Yes.
And if I think you kind of hinted it earlier in terms of letting them have, showing them the behavior you want to see rather than necessarily just constantly going on to the behavior you want to prevent.
Yes.
And we still see that level of tribalism, that kind of passion in games. Does it change the way we work?
I think one of the things that I've seen change, especially working more with devs now who haven't always worked in an online space, is breaking down a little bit of that barrier between the community and the developer. And I don't mean like total transparency and developers are available for like anything all the time, right? But I just mean that feeling of it's okay to talk to them. It's also okay to make a mistake in front of them. And it's okay to say you were wrong about something and apologize for it. And it's okay to invite them in. And I think that's a huge part of it. When I was on Guild Wars 2, like we did a lot of work inviting in content creators like pretty early. You know, we were like, yes, let's form a community with regular communication. Let's make connections directly with these people who are out there and love our game. They love it. They make content for it. They talk to a community about it. Let's invite them in. And then it gave us an opportunity when they were like maybe wanting to do one thing or another to say, oh, I mean, I actually talk to the team over at ArenaNet all the time. And I know that they have these community guidelines. I know that they have these goals and these things that they want to see for their community. And I mean, honestly, like almost every time they would say, oh, I want that now for you too, because I care about this game and you've shown you care about me and what I'm doing. So let's have those shared goals. And I'm not going to say this works every single time, but so much can be done by starting from a place of having explicit goals, sharing them with your community, sharing them with your content creators or your influencers or the people who are out there and representing and building community. They're not doing it on your behalf. And you got to remember that they have their own wants and needs and goals. But if you tell them what you're trying to do, a lot of times they care.
And it kind of reminds me of the difference between something like Wireplay or something like PlayStation Home. So in the Wireplay days, the 1,000 concurrency was a good thing.
Right.
Whereas now it's like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And the ability for us to be able to have defined roles in terms of club captain, club deputy, game pros, these kind of like social roles that we had volunteers doing, that you could do.
Yeah.
But when we enter the PlayStation Home, we've got millions of people playing. You cannot have that kind of like, well, you can't have the same effect.
Yeah.
By having, so you've got to kind of let other people take the natural space. So, you know, communities like Alpha Zone 4, who created their own newsletters, their own experiences, their kind of reasons, their highlights, the promotion, they became, you know, there were multiple groups like this. They become their own thing. And so we had to be strategic of who we could engage with.
Yeah.
And the fact that I could turn up and say, "Hey, I'm the Wireplay guy. You know, I'm the home architect." Those kind of moments had a profound impact, but they didn't really kind of change the daily behavior. They just made those people feel special. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's some great work. I'm a little obsessed with the idea of like anti-scale. Like I really think we're coming through to a place where we spend a lot of time being like, how can we get more and more people to do things bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more and more? Like there was this point in games where like, how can we get the most people on a map like that it can have ever been on a map? Wow, it'll be really cool to tell people there was 1,000 people concurrently on this map all looking at each other. I really think we're coming through because of community and recognizing that humans don't operate at that scale. And there's really nothing if you look at, you know, in research into anthropology or like
the Dunbar number.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with Robin Dunbar. I highly recommend people look at his work. Robin Dunbar's work is amazing.
Genuinely amazing.
He, just to give like a really quick recap for people who maybe don't know Dunbar, he was a researcher into primates. He started noticing that there was a connection between a particular like part of primates' brains and the number of social connections they were able to have. He looked at humans' brains and said, I bet it's about 50 close and about 150 loose connections, and then did a bunch of research and found out, yeah, that's pretty much it. We are confined by biology to some extent. We cannot have personal relationships with more than a certain number of people. So I'm really interested in what we've seen happen in the space somewhat organically with things like Discord, and Reddit even to some extent, even though I know the kids don't care about Reddit, but that kind of movement to sort of anti-scale is what I call it, is that people crave a community they can understand and a community they can know.
Well, it's meaningful. So, I mean, the first time I realized how powerful community was back in '98, where one of the regular players of Air Attack, an old flying game, died. And the community decided to put a gravestone in the map. This is a game that could have like 50 people concurrently at any time. it crashed at 150 people flying through.
Yeah.
Ended up on the Times newspaper. First time I'd ever seen anything publicly recognizing a game as a community, as a place for people who cared about each other.
Mhm.
It was one of the sort of most profound moments for me. And well, it's not every day that we see these things, but when you remember that people came to mourn the loss of a friend that they only ever met online in 98 on dial-up modems, that to me shows you how much further we are now, but also how much more, to your point, it's about what we care about.
I mean, when we think about why people play games, right? Like, why are humans even interested in playing games? It's somewhat complex in that there's motivations around, building skill and like doing all these things, but a lot of it is social. And it's funny to think that it has been hard in some ways for people to accept that like, oh, people might have real community inside of a game. When you think about, well, what about the history of sports? What about the history of other types of like in-person gaming? Of course, there's community inside of games. I think we've just struggled in some ways. In some ways, we've made amazing strides in the digital realm. In some ways, we have struggled because technology has sort of pushed us in one direction, and we have to grapple with what we lose when we step out of the real world when it comes to community interactions.
But equally, that's I think where the opportunity of the technology itself can help, because we don't have to have the vast world. We can have many more shards of the smaller world. We can use smarter techniques to be able to understand what people are doing, to help matchmake them into environments where you find people with different needs and wants that are compatible.
Yes.
Creating a more exciting worlds, which, perhaps without machine learning, perhaps without AI, we wouldn't have been able to do at this kind of scale. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. I mean, I think that when you look at like the technology that's driven us forward, and you think back about making MMOs in like the early 2000s, and the way that like the servers were done, and the way that we moved people around and did matchmaking, you're like, we never could have gotten to where we are now in that way, like where it is somewhat seamless. Right now, I mean, I can log in to Xbox or PlayStation 5 and just like be connected to Discord and like have my Discord list right there. And I can be like, oh, I'm playing this game. I'm in this Discord for this game. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Yes. But it also presents a scale problem on the other side. When I think about like Minecraft, there are like maybe hundreds of thousands of communities inside Minecraft. And they each have their own, they have their own ways, they have their own history, they have their own, social norms, they have all of their own things. They might look similar, but they're different, and they care about that difference. Yes. And then that presents a new challenge that I do think a lot of the tools we see coming up now are helping with, which is, okay, so, but let's say you run Minecraft and you have to deal with hundreds of thousands of communities. How do you do that?
And that, I mean, to be honest, that's the key, isn't it? I think it's not just Minecraft. I think the way that has changed our thinking is going to have a profound effect on anyone who's running a community for any game, is to start realizing that it's all about tribalism. It's all about the how we identify us and them, and how we create that as a positive force rather than a negative force.
Yeah.
So we've only got a minute or so left. I mean, I wanted to go into like the horror stories. If you don't know, Kristen has a fantastic podcast called The Art of Live Ops, and always asks her guests, what's the biggest disaster experience?
Yes, I love, live ops disasters are the best part.
They're just the best part ever. But I don't have a huge amount of time. What's the one thing that you think from your career, if somebody was making a community-based experience today, what is that one thing that you think that they mustn't forget, mustn't ignore?
Wow. If it was just one thing, I would say consistency.
Yeah. That's a good one. I like that one.
Yeah. Like teams are often like, how do I build a community? And it's hard, but one of the keys is consistency. Like get out there and do it, but do it consistently. Whatever you're doing, whether you're inviting people in, whether you're speaking to them, whether you're creating content in order to sort of set the table or invite people in to what you want to be, what you're creating, do it consistently.
And I don't think you can get that consistency unless you've planned ahead. You've got the infrastructure that can support that. You can actually automate that process so that it doesn't get missed. I'm going to add a little bit to it. I think you should be thinking about Columbo. honestly, Columbo, TV show Columbo, best TV show ever made, according to Stephen Fry. If you're a UK person, you'll know who exactly I'm talking about. The reason why Stephen Fry talks about Columbo as being the best TV show ever made is because, 5 minutes before the end, he is going to say just one more thing to the murderer. You've already seen who the murderer is at the beginning of the show. You're going to have a whole show where you're not trying to work out who did it. You're trying to work out how Columbo solves it before he does. The beautiful thing about that is, and the reason why it's a metaphor for all things community experience, is that we don't have to worry about everyday stuff, because the watcher of Columbo is looking at everything that's happening, whether it was intentional or accidental. If some extra dropped a pen, someone is going to think that Columbo thought that was deliberate. It's the predictable surprise. When we reveal the murderer and how Columbo solved it, we were either right, in which case we're delighted, or we were wrong, in which case we work out the thing we missed, and therefore we're delighted. We need to replicate that in our community experiences. Let the players fill the space with their imagination and deliver them value and excitement and satisfaction regardless of the outcome.
That's a great metaphor.
Thank you very much.
I like it.
And on that note, thank you to Kristen.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
It's absolutely fun. And I think we've got a little bit of a break before we have our following panel. So please stay with us. Please bear with us. We're going to be talking about exciting things soon. Oh, sorry. Yes, go for it. Sorry, I was having so much fun talking to Kristen. Does anyone have any questions? Go for it. Sorry, that's it.
Oh my goodness, I kind of blanked on my question now. At the beginning, you were talking about having spaces in game, within the actual game itself, for communities to grow and kind of create. And I'm curious if you have any really good examples or things that you've seen just work flawlessly to keep community building in game versus like on Discord or something like that. Because there's nothing wrong with Discord, but I think the goal is,
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things is to think about what the goal is. Like, what are your players going to want to do together, and make space for that, make physical space for that. There's a lot of thinking around humans. We feel really deeply about, like, this is actually a great example. Like, we're here together in this room. It's arranged in a particular way, and that may, like, invite people to feel more like engaged with each other, and like, because you can kind of see each other's faces and things like that. So make sure you make space for that. In a game where the way you express yourself is really important. So if it's all about like personal expression, you want there to be a space where you can show off what you look like. And so you need to even think about, this is getting kind of nitty gritty into like level design, but like sight lines, and like whether or not there's enough space for people together, and like whether or not people can do the things they want to do in that space and see each other. Whereas if the point of your game is to strategize, and that's like where most of the community is happening, you probably want more intimate spaces. You probably want places that feel more like secure and like we're here together to do this thing. One of my favorite spaces like this is the pre-game lobby in both PUBG and Fortnite. I love the pre-game. Like, it's very short. Like, it doesn't last that long, but it is a place where you see pure community joy. Like, just go in there. People are like hopping up and down, and they're dancing, and they're like trying to make conga lines, and they're doing all kinds of stuff. That's amazing. Like, those spaces are incredible. Lots of MMOs, if you've ever like played one and been like, why is there always a big town? Like, why is there always like a big, fortress or something that we're all going back to all the time? That's why. Like, they're trying to make space for people to do things, share message with each other, and things like that.
Absolutely. And one of the things, key lessons from PlayStation Home for me was understand that architecture is UX in a virtual world. It is usability, it's user flow, it's user engagement. And like you say, the intimacy of a small space versus the accessibility of a larger space, they do different things behaviorally to people.
I think if you're really interested in like spatial design, I highly recommend reading Christopher Alexander. Like, he's sort of a huge influence on a lot of early video games as well.
I only discovered that recently as well. It may even have been you who told me about it.
I like Christopher Alexander. Christopher Alexander, he was an architect and sort of
it's really good.
a designer. Any
other questions? They're going to let me carry on for a bit. So let's go over here.
Hi.
How do you translate concepts like safety, respect, friendly, things like that into game loops that teach those things? So how do you take it from cool ideas into put this into your game? This will teach people to be X, like be a good community member.
Yeah, I think there's I'm going to nitpick your question a little bit, but that I will get to maybe hopefully what the meat is. I think it can be a little dangerous to start thinking we're going to teach people to do things. I think you want to start from a place of encouraging the behavior that that you're hoping to see, and making sure you're not creating barriers to that behavior or like disincentives to the kind of behavior you want to see. Teaching can get a little bit rough, because then you start I mean, there are ways to do it, but you're going to get all the way into like practice and like positive reinforcement loops, which you maybe is the whole goal of your game. And then like, great, go do those things. But the first step, I think, for a lot of games who have more traditional game loops is to think, am I creating perverse incentives? Like, am I making it actually a good thing to do something I don't want in here? Or am I creating barriers to do the good thing, to do the thing that I've decided is good? This is a really like dumb, simple example at this point, but like back in the day in MMOs, when loot dropped in the world, it just existed in the world and people had to kind of fight over it. And then at some point somebody said, wait, that seems like it just creates toxicity amongst the players. What if everyone had their own loot, which was a big deal back in the day? People had their own loot. But that is something to say, like, are we doing something that's creating like a perverse incentive here? This comes up a lot too in competitive games, and I'm definitely not saying you can't have positivity inside of competitive games. And I would encourage people to look deeply at like sportsmanship and the way that's encouraged in like the real world. But you need to be aware that when you create a situation where strangers need to have high trust in each other, you're gonna have tension.
Yeah. I mean, one example I always go to is obviously in the first-person shooter, we often see games where the more you play, the better you do, the better equipment you get. Therefore, you make it harder for anyone who hasn't won to even take part. And there was a guy called Mark Wood who I worked with at NVIDIA, it turned out, later on, after I first discovered this, did a mod called Weapon of Choice on Quake 2. Best mod ever. Basically, if you killed me, I lost the rocket launcher. Sorry, if I killed you and you didn't kill me, I lost the rocket launcher. If I killed you again, I lost the lightning gun. Eventually, I got down to an axe. We were running this game, and all the newbies were playing with the rocket launchers, shooting at the really good guys. We're just dodging them, and the guys who were really good had axes. It was absolute chaos, and it was so much joy. But what it meant was I didn't have people who were toxic to each other in that context, because they could still play with each other. Whereas almost every first-person shooter out there simply reinforces how bad you are if you're not good. So if you're dyspraxic like me, you can't compete, and therefore you don't play, as opposed to feeling like you're part of an embedded, beautiful community.
I would also say give your players plausible deniability.
Yes. Yes.
One of my favorite examples of this is Mario Kart, which is famous for creating these incredibly annoying experiences where someone blue shells you. And yet no one is ever like, is like a really toxic community is the Mario Kart community. That's a real toxic. And a lot of it is because that game does a beautiful job of creating plausible deniability. It's like, I'm not a bad person for blue shelling you. This is the way the game works. I can't help it. Like, it sort of forces me into this. I mean, that can drive people crazy a little bit because that game is so beautifully built in order to specifically not be competitive, which sometimes people are like, why can't the best player win? It's like not the point of Mario Kart. But plausible deniability can also be a big help, because when you create situations where players are like, I know you did that just because now I can imagine you're a bad person, that can create a lot of trouble.
But I think that's great. I mean, but I think for me, it's like we often focus on extrinsic reward. We don't often focus enough on intrinsic. And I think the more we can make it intrinsic, the better. And quite often I see games where the designers are layering things on rather than subverting the, like, for example, energy mechanics just annoy people. But if you instead slow down the rewards, you're now getting the same benefit of an energy system, but without the frustration. In fact, the end of that frustration is a reward, therefore less painful. Not always the case, but that's the principle. Anyway, have we got time for one more? Anyone? Yeah, one more. Anyone want to take that last question? This is your opportunity. You look, yeah, go for it.
I don't need it. Have you seen
It's for the stream.
I was just curious if you'd seen Poker Face. If you love Columbo, you're gonna love Poker Face. I promise. It's a great show. Ryan Johnson kills it.
That's awesome.
I haven't. I must do this now. It's now on my to-dos.
This is a successful event because you have gotten a good recommendation for.
I'm happy. I'm done now. I can go. No, I can't go. Can't go. Cool. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Hopefully that was your enjoy.
Always fun.
Okay, we'll be back at 1:30. The Art of Live Ops is Kristen's podcast. Yeah. I'm doing one called Game Dev London podcast. But yeah. Thank you for reminding me to ask questions.
Just real quick, everyone, we'll take a break for half an hour, and then we'll come back for another panel, and then do lunch after. So if you have any more questions, feel free to grab Oscar or Kristen before they take off, and we'll see you back in a bit.
I can't fight you on that one.